Lovely. I think we'll get going. Good morning, everyone, and a very big welcome to the second flash session in the Australian Population Webinar Series. I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional land I'm sitting on, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and to pay my respects to the elders past and present. I'm thankful for their deep and continuing connection to this beautiful land and the contributions that they make to this region. I'd also like to extend this respect to all First Nations people who are joining us today. So this morning we have an exciting session featuring hand-picked emerging researchers from across the country. Each speaker will have 5 minutes to discuss their research, and then we're going to open up to question time at the end. Please put your questions in the Q&A function, or if you'd like to, you can also raise your virtual hand and we'll unmute you to ask the question. So in order of the presentations today, we've got Maximiliano Alvarez from the University of Queensland, and they're going to be talking about understanding internal migration trends in OECD countries. This is followed by Suganini Kalemba, who's also from the University of Queensland. They're going to be talking about analysing the drivers of internal migration decline in Australia. We then have Madeline Morey from the University of Adelaide. Their topic is structural barriers and the economic integration of New Zealanders living in Australia. Following this, we have Esther Lazari from our own Australian National University, speaking on an assessment of the contribution of assisted reproductive technologies in total fertility rates in Australia. And finally, we have Fiona Shaley from Charles Darwin University talking on identity statistics. So a very big welcome to all of them. And we can start today then with Maximiliano. Over to you.
Thank you. Okay. Hi, everyone. First, thank you for joining me in this short presentation. I also want to thank the Australian Population Association for giving me the opportunity to share my research with you. My PhD thesis is titled Understanding Internal Migration Trends in OECD Countries. Hi. In the last 20 years, population scholars have become increasingly concerned on internal migration trends after pioneering works show that internal migration declined in the US since the 1960s. And other authors have found downward trends in internal migration in Australia, the UK, and Canada. And then they have centered all the attention on explaining these trends. However, a recent cross-national comparison of countries show that the decline is not universal. In the table on the right, you can see some of the results, and they found that the decline is mainly in about half of the 42 countries. However, their evidence has some important limitations. They mainly use, they compare internal migration intensities between two census rounds. So it is unclear whether these changes reflect also short-term fluctuations due to, for instance, changing economic conditions. But this evidence still raises the question of why internal migration declines in some countries, but not in others. Therefore, the main purpose of my research is to identify the extent of variation in internal migration trends in a diversified sample of OECD countries and to determine the factors underpinning them. In this presentation, I will focus on the first two specific objectives. The first one is to identify the intensity of internal migration for a large sample of OECD countries. And second, to determine the factors influencing internal migration trends, distinguishing between short and long-term effects. So I first assembled a mountain series of inter-regional migration intensities for 18 OECD countries, which is computed at all changes of residence that cross administrative regions within a country in a year divided by the total population at the beginning of the year. So in this table, you can see the list of countries I computed the interregional migration intensities, the period, and the name of the regions for which interregional migration is computed, and the data sources. So the first results show that indeed there is a decline in internal migration, but it's mainly non-European. 4 out of the 18 countries don't show an upward trend, and 8 countries show an upward trend. To understand the factors behind these trends, I also assembled annual time series on 6 explanatory factors. The ones are in the left table, and you can also see the measure of these variables and the sources. And the table on the right, you can see the estimation of the short and long-term effects. And the first thing is that the negative between 0 and -1 and significant error correction term is evidence that these effects are belong to a long-term equilibrium relationship. And we can see that internal migration have a positive response to increasing the proportion of young adults, the internet users, regional disparities, and international migration. And in the short run, only to regional disparities. So the conclusions are that using a more updated and annual data on OECD countries, we confirm that the decline is mainly non-European, and it has leveled off in the last decade. Most of the included factors have long-term relationships with internal migration, and evidence of short-term effect is only significant for regional disparities. Changes in the proportion of young adults have the largest effect on interregional migration, while regional disparities in international migration and ICT sometimes reinforce or counteract effect. However, the model doesn't explain the trends in countries like Australia and the United States. Therefore, we need a longer time series of internal migration and these potential drivers, annual measures of other factors like dwell-earner households and transport indicators. And they will improve the estimation of the relationship between internal migration and its determinants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maximiliano. We now move to Sunganini for their presentation.
Thank you. So my name is Sunganan Kalemba. I'm a third-year PhD student with the University of Queensland, and my thesis is looking at understanding the decline in internal migration levels in Australia. I just want to thank you, IPF, for allowing us to present our research here. So as a brief background, as some of you may already know, Australia is one of the most highly mobile countries in the world, with 40% of the population changing addresses at least once in every 5 years. However, there's been a substantial decline in internal migration intensities since the 1980s, as you can see from the graph. As of now, there's very limited research on Australia. The research that is there is highly descriptive. We have to rely on research findings from the US. As a result, the causes of this decline remains unknown. However, there's been some hypotheses that are put in place to try to explain this decline, and these range from changes in population composition towards people who are less mobile, or increase in place attachment. However, some people suggest that people are not attached to place, but rather they are trapped by structural factors such as housing regulations, especially in the US. Others suggest that the decline is as a result of decrease in regional disparities, especially with income, so it makes no sense to move. Others attribute it to the progress in information technologies, which makes it easier to know about alternate locations, and therefore people don't need to move. While others yet attribute it to a rise in alternate forms of mobility, such as teleworking, as we have seen with COVID, and long distance commuting. So, in an effort to establish the drivers that are driving this decline, I have these 4 objectives, but I'm going to share with you what I'm doing for the second and the third objective. The second objective looks at the contribution of changes in population composition to the decline in migration levels. And the third one intends to establish how the motives of migration have evolved over time and how this has contributed to the observed decline. So for the second objective, as I mentioned, I'm going to look at the changes in population composition and determine whether these are driving the decline or it is a behavior effect. For this, I relied on a decomposition method that looked at census microdata between the periods 2001 and 2016. So my results, which are on the bar graph on the right, the purple is the behavior effect, while the composition effect is captured in pink. If it is negative, that means the change during that this period of time should have resulted in a decline in migration levels. If it is positive, that means the change resulted in an increase in migration levels. So I'll start with the composition effects. If you look at the composition effects for age, which is in pink, you see that it is negative. This indicates that the aging of Australian population during this time should have resulted in a decline in internal migration levels, but it ended up being counteracted by an increase in the proportion of high mobility groups, such as with tertiary education and renters. If we move to the behavior effects, all the age groups were moving more because it is positive for the behavior effect. And other recent migrants were also moving more. But where is the decline coming from then? If you look, I have a high constant. So the conclusion from this is that this decline has been driven by behavioral factors other than the ones that we have captured in the model. So this result is not unique to Australia. They have found similar findings in the US and the UK, and this has been attributed, as I mentioned in the beginning, to increased rootedness, or others calling it entrapment. How do we capture the behavior effect then? This is driving me the third objective, which looks at the reasons that people give for moving over time. And we have data for this in Australia, which is the HIWDA database. I'm using a trend analysis as well as logistic regression to tease out the trends and drivers of these trends. But my preliminary results, as you can see from the trend, from the trends on the right, the decline in all reasons for moving over time, especially since the GFC, which was in 2007. The level of decline between these two end periods, which is a 5-year moving average, are captured in the brackets, and the aesthetics indicate the statistical significance. So the trends are declining and the statistical significance for all reasons of moving. If we can conclude away again from this graph is that composition in reasons for moving hasn't changed as well. So people are still moving for relatively the same reasons, but just moving less. What I'm seeing from this is that the decline is therefore not driven by one particular reason for moving. And as the next step going forward from this is looking at the drivers and how they change over time to influence the trend. My fourth objective will then try to quantify the place of flow management, because I think this is where this is leading into by using more variables in the HIWDA database. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. Very interesting. I'm sure we'll have questions about that at the end. All right. So let's now move to Madeline for her presentation.
No. Can we see that?
Yes, we can see it. If you click on display settings at the top, Madeline, and then, swap presenter view, then we'll just get the slide. There we go.
So I'm just presenting one, I suppose, like tiny aspect of my research results from my thesis. So broadly, my research examined how policy changes affected the integration and transnational practices of New Zealanders living in Australia. But I'm going to be focusing on specifically the economic integration of New Zealanders today. So in my research, I conducted an online survey in which I obtained just over 2,000 responses, and I also conducted 22 semi-structured interviews as well. So since 1973, the migration of New Zealanders to Australia has been governed by the Trans-Tasman Travel Arrangement. Under this arrangement, any New Zealander, provided they meet the character requirements, can travel to Australia and also live and work in Australia as well. So up until 2001, New Zealanders who moved to Australia were granted automatic permanent residency on arrival into Australia. However, a policy change in 2001 revoked this right, with it the automatic access to social security services, requiring those who've moved since this time to apply for permanent residency. So unlike Australia's migration program, which grants migrants from other countries entry into Australia based on a range of human capital attributes, including education and occupation, the open nature of the Trans-Tasman Travel Arrangement means any New Zealander, regardless of their occupation, can move to Australia. So hence, I was particularly interested in finding out about New Zealanders' labour market experiences, given they can be largely categorised as what is termed in the literature a middling migrant, meaning they don't fall neatly into the low high skilled dichotomy. So given the geographic proximity and the cultural similarities between the two countries, many respondents were surprised to face challenges gaining employment in Australia. Respondents' experiences of applying for jobs were similar to what has been discussed in the research that has looked at refugees and also highly skilled migrants in Australia. Respondents found that the New Zealand work experience wasn't necessarily recognised, nor did they have, but again, employers were still wanting them to have Australian work experience. And often New Zealand work referees weren't recognised either. For some respondents, their New Zealand qualifications weren't recognised, which came as a surprise for many, and for many people it wasn't a financial training wasn't necessarily financially possible. So I also asked a range of questions in terms of how long it took people to find a job. So just under a quarter of respondents had a job offer before moving to Australia, yet for a similar percentage, it took them longer than a month to gain employment in Australia. For some female respondents, because moving to Australia with their partner and children meant an income increase for their partners, many didn't necessarily enter the workforce upon moving to Australia, as they were able to stay home and look after their children. So for these respondents, when they then had to enter the workforce, say maybe 5-10 years after arriving in Australia, often their work referees weren't relevant, nor was their previous work experience. So in terms of length with their current employer, 20% had been in their job for less than 12 months. With 42.5% having been in their current job between 1 and 5 years. I also asked respondents how many jobs they had had since living in Australia, with 19.1% having 6 or more jobs and 18.5% only having had 1 job. So one thing that surprised many respondents was the prevalence of casual employment in Australia. 17.3% of respondents indicated that they were employed on a contract basis when asked if the job was permanent or contract. So being employed on a casual basis affected respondents' integration into the workplace, as being casual meant there was no employment security, and also affected their ability to form friendships with colleagues due to unpredictable work schedules. So while the implications obviously with casual employment has been, highlighted during COVID, for New Zealanders who have arrived since 2001, casual employment not only affects their integration into Australia, but also their socio-cultural and political integration. So being employed casually means that individuals are unable to predict their income, which then in turn affects what type of housing they can afford and the area of the city they can live in as well. It also has implications on their ability to become politically integrated, as the current permanent residency pathway for New Zealanders, which came into effect in 2017, is based on income, so the income is about just under $58,000, which individuals need to have earned that amount for the previous 4 tax years. So hence being employed casually means they don't know if they'll get that income that year or if they'll be able to meet those income requirements for those consecutive years. So this affects hence their ability to obtain a citizenship and secure their legal status in Australia. It also, for those also employed casually, since they don't have access to unemployment benefits in Australia, it means that if they do lose their job, they have to ensure that they have enough money until they find their next job. And for many, not returning to New Zealand isn't an option if they lose their job, as their lives are in Australia. So because of these, I suppose, structural barriers in terms of casual employment and that system, which is outside Australia's migration program, sort of highlights how those systems have affected the integration of New Zealanders into Australia, not only economically, but also socio-culturally and politically as well. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Madeline. Right, now we are up to the next presentation. This is by Esther. You ready to go, Esther?
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you so much, Edith. In this brief presentation, I'd like to talk about assisted reproductive technologies and their impact on fertility in Australia. ART are a group of medical procedures that can help couples achieving a pregnancy when there is a fertility problem. And I think some of these technologies are well known, like, for example, IVF. In Australia, just like in many other developed countries, the mean age of childbearing has been rising considerably since the 1970s, when having children after the age of 30 started to become increasingly more common. As we can see in this figure, where age-specific fertility rates have been increasing only for women aged 30 and above since the 1970s, while they have been declining for the other ages. From a biological point of view, however, the ability to conceive a baby rapidly declines with age, and therefore, over time, the cases of age-related infertility have increased because of childbearing delay, and so too the share of women remaining involuntarily childless or having less children than what they initially planned. As a consequence, there has been an increase in the demand for ART, and this is also partly due to a relatively supportive public health system that we have here in Australia, which covers about 80% of total costs with no limit on age, number of cycles already performed, or number of children already born. The study uses the Australia and New Zealand Assisted Reproduction Database, or ANZAD for short, which collects information about all ART cycles conducted in Australia and the resulting pregnancies and births. The study analyzed all ART conceived babies in Australia between 2010 and 2017, the demographic characteristics of mothers giving birth using ART, and it also decomposes the changes in the TFR into ART and non-ART contributions. This figure shows the share of ART births out of total births by age group. ART births before the age of 30 accounted for only 1% of total births and therefore are not shown in this figure. There has been an important increase at age 45 and above, from only 6 to around 30% of total births, and then a more modest increase in the 40 to 44 age group from 14 to 18%. However, despite these important increases at all the reproductive ages, the majority of assisted childbearing happened at younger reproductive ages between 30 and 39, which accounted for almost 75% of total assisted births. The proportion of women with no previous births was higher among women giving birth via ART than among women giving birth naturally for all age groups, and there has been an accentuation of this trend over time. Hence, it seems that ART are mainly used by childless women wishing to have their first child, rather than by mothers wishing to increase their family size. Apart from computing the proportion of births, we can also try to make an estimate of the impact of ART on fertility by decomposing the change in the TFR between 2010 and 2017, and looking at how ART and non-ART births contributed to this change. Most of the decline was due to a decline in young reproductive ages in non-ART fertility rates, while at older ages, the decline in non-ART fertility rates was partly offset by increases in ART births, which have been really the only positive component of fertility change over these last recent years. We could also summarize this figure in what happened before and after the age of 32, and see that at younger ages, ART does not have any impact, but at older ages, it was responsible for offsetting almost half of the decline in the TFR. When trying to estimate the demographic impact of ART, however, there are a number of potential unintended consequences that we should be aware of. First, the availability of ART may provide premature provision of treatment to couples that would have eventually conceived without it. And second, ART may represent an incentive to further delay childbearing. Both aspects would lead to an overestimation of the impact of ART on the TFR. Summing up, ART have contributed to an average annual increase of the TFR of 0.08, which corresponds to approximately 1 in 20 births in 2017. Hence, this analysis has shown that the TFR would have been substantially lower without ART. And when we compare this impact with other more traditional fertility policies, ART has a comparable effect, which suggests that it might be used successfully along with other policy tools to raise fertility. ART success rate rapidly decline with age, and for this reason, it is important that their availability does not encourage people to further postpone childbearing. And with that, I end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esther. All right, last but not least, we would like to welcome Fiona, our final presentation, and then we'll move to the Q&A section of today. Thank you, Fiona.
Can you see that?
Yes, indeed.
Can you still see it?
Yes, and again, yeah, if you just swap there, that's great.
Okay, thank you for the invitation to speak today. And first up, I'd just like to thank Tom Wilson, who's my supervisor. His patience, support, and good humour has been a constant in my academic life. Thank you for attending today, and I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands I'm presenting from, the Larrakia. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to their emerging leadership. Today I'm going to present on identity statistics, and more specifically the challenge of minority group identification to demographic methods. So I'm at the beginning of this journey, so I will really just today set up the context and touch briefly on some early results. So why should demographers care about identity? Well, it's personal. And to paraphrase Erik Erikson, who's probably the father of identity research, it can be described as a person's unconscious striving for continuity of their character, shaped by their biological characteristics, their psychological needs, and the cultural and social structure within which their identity is shaped. So the influence of the broader society on identity formation means that it's often understood as a specifically collective phenomenon and is shaped by our connections to the world. So let's agree that it's a complex construct. But where it gets even trickier is that it's not fixed. Rather, it may change with personal experience and the actual process of identifying. So for demographers, identity interacts with the quality and usefulness of data about population groups because the groups are themselves defined by the people who belong to them. Identity is key for estimating the populations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians and people who belong to a sexual minority. But the process of numeric description is necessarily reductive. As demographers, we classify people using categories that are meant to cover everybody in the group, and we want to include that same population each time data is gathered to monitor change. So we make assumptions or expect people to identify in the same way. Common to both these population groups is their definition is made up of multiple characteristics. category flux has been observed. So that's people moving from different ethnic identities or across multiple sexualities, and has temporal fluidity. Gaps and missing data is common, and it's often caused by personal experiences of trauma or discrimination, and statistical adjustments are required for the expected underestimation. So my PhD will explore these issues using two population themes. The first is ethnic identity, which is based on beliefs in shared culture and common ancestry, and includes components of biogenetics and genealogy, but also social classification and categorization and history. Indeed, the connection between categories provided in a national census and the construction of a national identity often led to minority making, with Indigenous peoples part of the excluded minority group, and they hold a particular and very significant place in a country with a colonised past. So the focus of my PhD in this theme will be on the consequences of how this population is defined statistically as a singular collective and then counted and estimated. So my first PhD paper looks at the population who stepped away from an Indigenous identity from one census to the next. This has been enabled by the linked census datasets. My early results show this population is smaller than the population newly identifying as Indigenous, but still significant. And the transitions are linked with those who identify their status in the first place, either person or someone else, general transitions across the life stages, the identity of a significant partner or being unpartnered, having mixed ancestry, and living in more urbanized places. My next population theme picks up sex, gender, and sexual orientation, which are themselves interrelated. So sexual identity is part of the construct of a person's sexual orientation, with research showing it can be very fluid across a lifetime. So with Tom Wilson and others, we have recently updated estimates of Australia's adult sexual minority population, but these include multiple assumptions because sexual identity is not collected in large data sets like the census. My first paper in this theme profiles Australia's same-sex marriage pioneers, where sexual identity distinguishes the population and sets up future research because same-sex married couples will be explicitly identified in the next census. My results showed Australia's same-sex couples actually embraced the opportunity to marry. Using population estimates mentioned previously, we found that the marriage rate of lesbian couples was twice that of different sex couples, and also higher than for gay couples. Australia also had high proportions of same-sex marriage in the first year when compared to a range of other countries internationally, and we asked whether this is likely to continue. These first data allow demographers to think about future impacts on fertility and mobility for this population group, and monitor trends around service delivery and general well-being for these new family units. Finally, I'm hoping my PhD will contribute to increased accuracy of minority population estimation by providing improved understanding of identity and identity transitions, and most importantly, improved information for these significant minority populations about themselves. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Fiona. So 5 excellent presentations there. We're now going to move to the question and answer part of today's session. There's a couple of questions already in the Q&A, which I'll read out in a moment, but just to remind you, if you'd like to ask a question, please put your question in the Q&A, or alternatively raise your virtual hand and we will come to you so you can ask your question in person. All right, so the first question from Chingguan is to Maximiliano. How do you account for the different geographic features? So for example, the size of a subnational region or population density of the OECD countries examined?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And yeah, so the differences, like the size, the number of regions between countries, is accounted by using fixed effects, because this is a feature like it is fixed under the period under examination, which is from 1996 to 2018, and so they are fixed. I'm using only the first division, administrative division in each country. They have been constant over time. So the difference between country, I take them through these fixed effects, which is time invariant. I control for all the time invariant features. The other thing, the model, so density probably is not time invariant, but I also take the cross-sectional deviation from the average sum of the all countries. So in that way, control for all common factors. So if density is growing in every country, I will take into account these differences between periods. And the final thing is that the model is dynamic. So that means that it includes lag values of the dependent variable, in this case, internal migration, and also the explanatory factor. So it's basically controlling for many things. We don't expect the estimations to be biased, but yeah, it has the limitation that I'm not probably, and as I said, it doesn't explain the trends in all the countries. Probably there are other factors affecting the trends in some of the countries. But yeah, that's mainly the controls that I use to address these issues.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Maximiliano. And Ching, if you have a follow-up question at all, feel free to put that into the Q&A. We'll move now to a question by James Raymer, and then I see that Anne Evans also has her hand up, so we'll go to that after this one. So Suganini, thank you for your presentation. Have you considered the intersection between macro processes and micro processes or individual behaviours? And are you able to include that as part of your research? What do you think you might find as a result? You're muted.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, James, for your question. As you might suspect, the two are interlinked indeed. I haven't been able to include them as part of my analysis at this point, but there are certainly contenders. I do think that the two are interrelated. As I mentioned in my earlier slides, that the hypothesis point to things like a decline in regional convergence, a decline in regional disparities, that the regions are becoming more similar. So people are not moving to alternate location because it's as good as staying where you are. So definitely those macro factors are definitely contenders, but I haven't gotten to that level yet. I can just speculate that they should be important, judging from what the findings from the US tell us. So in the US, when they look at the internal migration decline, they say it might be as a result of a decline in labor market fluidity. So people are moving less in the labor market. We see that in Australia, as part of my descriptive stats, that there's been a slight decline in people changing jobs, a slight decline in people changing industries and occupations. What we're expecting is that if people are changing jobs less, maybe they should be changing industries and occupations more as a substitute for moving to alternate regions. But we're not seeing that. So I'm still playing around with the ideas. I'd be happy to get any suggestions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And again, if there is a follow-up question to that, please go ahead and pop it into the Q&A. Now, Anne Evans, did you have a question?
Sorry, Edith, I had a rogue hand up.
Okay, no problem.
Pressed the wrong button, sorry.
Okay, that's fine. Right. Okay, well, while we're waiting for some more, oh yes.
Sorry, Edith, I would like to say that I enjoyed all of those presentations though, so thank you very much.
Yeah, really great. Okay, thank you. Okay, we have a question from Andrew Taylor. Thank you to each presenter for their very interesting talks and slides. Yes, agreed. Suganini, could you remind me what the aim is per an earlier slide in your presentation? So what, yes. Sorry, AIM data.
I have, okay, my overall aim is to look at the drivers of internal migration decline in Australia.
I think, did you refer to some data called AIM?
No.
Sorry, we couldn't hear you for a bit there.
Was it actually a data set called AIM?
Okay, the Australian Internal Migration Data Set. This is managed by the Centre of Population Research here at the University of Queensland. It looks at providing migration data, internal migration data within Australia for temporary consistent regions, which are called TSDs. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, hopefully, Andrew, that answers your question. Yes, thank you, he says. Okay, we have any other questions at the moment? I have a question for Madeline. So it sounded like quite a large or a substantial proportion, I guess, of New Zealanders who come to Australia end up in a sort of a precarious working position. And do you have any information on, did they also have that sort of situation before they migrated as well, or?
I didn't look at, I suppose, what their work situation was, but it was something that sort of had come up in interviews and also the survey. So like one interviewee had been a primary school teacher in the UK, but had moved to Australia, and so had expected that, you know, through relief teaching, because that's what she'd done previously, that she'd be able to get a permanent job that way. But it was, you know, for her it was 5 years of casual contracts, which she hadn't anticipated. So I think also because in New Zealand, the like casual employment laws are different as well. So after a certain period of time, you are entitled to some forms of leave, whereas here you aren't. So yeah, it sort of was a surprise that that's what, when you apply for a job, you just get offered a fixed term contract or a casual contract. So yeah.
Thank you. I mean, maybe just a quick follow-up. Did you collect your own data?
Yeah, I collected my own data. So yeah, it was an online survey which I distributed.
Okay, thank you. Still no questions appearing, so I'm going to just check the chat. Sometimes they appear there. Yes, I do have one in the chat. So for Fiona, do you think people actively decide to become non-Indigenous, or is it, for example, variability in how people fill out their census form, and perhaps who fills out the form?
Thanks, James. It's difficult for me to talk on behalf of others, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but certainly our data is showing that there is a big change in identification when people move, probably out of their family home. So yes, it's picking up that change in who fills out the form. So we see the age being a significant variable in predicting people who step away from an Indigenous identity, but the data now that we can look at over those 3 time points suggests that people do move back. So they may step away, but then may step back again. The other thing that we're picking up in age is that we have people stepping away when they're older. So the group that's over 60 is also having an impact on the whole population of Indigenous people. So that may indeed go back to the who's filling out the census form on their behalf, or it could be picking up those big past experiences of cultural trauma and discrimination that they've experienced. So they're still, you know, grappling with that sort of level of trust. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to sort of unpick some of these issues by speaking with people about their experiences of identification and try and understand what the process of identification in statistical data sets might look like for some people.
Thank you. And Fiona, I have a follow-up question for you. Well, it's a different question, but another question from James Raymer. So for ethnic identification, I can see how parents or community can play an important role in influencing a person's own identity. For sexual minority identification, are there similar outside influences?
Again, I'm not sure at this stage, but it's a really interesting question. So my journey at this point is just to actually have a look at the same-sex marriage couples and try and understand, you know, why they want to marry and the importance of marriage to them. But it's obvious in that data. We picked up some people from other minority sexualities, so people who identify themselves as a non-specific sex getting married. So that's a very interesting subpopulation who still look to marriage as a way to cement their relationships. What we don't see in that marriage data is the bisexual population. So we can't identify whether bisexual people are actually marrying other bisexual people or whether they're marrying another partner. And so my next piece of research is going to have a look at transitions in sexual identity for that particular group using HILDA data. And I think that will be really interesting in understanding, again, what's influencing those transitions.
That's great. Thank you so much. So there are no other questions appearing. I have a question for Esther. Esther, I think one of the things you found there was that that the contribution of ART births to the TFR was fairly substantial, around 0.08. How does that compare to other countries?
Hi, thank you for the question. Yeah, so there are many analyses like this one that look at ART data and try to estimate the demographic contribution on the TFR. There's a paper in 2008 that showed that in Denmark the contribution was around 0.06. I don't want to say something wrong, but yeah, slightly lower than what I found. And yeah, well, in UK it was a bit lower because ART are not publicly funded by the government, so it was estimated to be around 0.05 from what I remember. But yeah, it was now around 10 years ago, so these things can change very quickly. As we can see also from the analysis that I've done, which increased from 4% to 5% of total births in only like 8 years. So yeah, I think it's a pretty important contribution in this international comparison, but that there's not enough data for like a large number of countries.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, Fiona has a question.
Yeah. I thought your presentation was fascinating, Esther, and I wonder whether you had also thought about the opportunities that open to same-sex marriage couples, particularly lesbian couples, to access assistive technologies as well. Because we see this feminization trend of same-sex marriages around the world, and it feels like lesbian couples see marriage as probably safer for their own legal protections and potentially also for bringing up families. So I wondered if you had any look at that.
Yeah, I definitely thought about it, and it's really fascinating how, thanks to these technologies, it's possible for more modern family structures that wouldn't have been able to conceive a baby traditionally to be able to actually have one. Yeah, my database unfortunately didn't allow to look at this because I only have data on women that had the child, but I don't have any information on their family situation. So yeah, there might as well be some of these women that wouldn't have had that maybe were part of a lesbian couple. But yeah, this I wouldn't know. And yeah, it would be interesting to do something in that direction, I think.
Thank you. So I have a question from James for Maximiliano and Suganini. So this is for both of you. You can take turns. Do we know how age patterns of internal migration have been changing over time? So for example, have we seen a change in the propensity for people of retirement age to migrate?
I can attempt.
Sorry.
I can attempt that. For the first part, my decomposition paper, it showed that even though there was an increase in people who were aging, in my paper, I classified them as people who were age 65 plus. Their behavior-wise, they were moving more. So all age groups were moving more, which is quite interesting. I hope that makes sense. Even though their compositional contribution had increased, their behavioral effect was positive because they were moving more in 2016 compared to in 2001.
Okay, thank you. Maximiliano, do you have anything to add to that?
We're gonna hear you.
Sorry, Maximiliano, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah,
Sorry, Maximiliano, you're muted.
So I don't look at the age patterns of internal migration. I look at, like, I have my variable is the proportion of young adults, and I see how I look how the change in the proportion of young adults affect the migration, but not, I don't have if each age specific group move more or less, but I can say that, for instance, for Australia, the proportion of young adults was declining, but it's not declining anymore. The proportion of young adults in other countries like Italy, Japan has been declining very fast in other countries. So the contribution of these, because the young adults are the more mobile, the contribution of these is much larger to the decline in other countries. But in Australia, it has not been declining in the last decade. So actually, we don't see a decline in internal migration in Australia in the last, at least like from 2010 or something like that. So I don't know.
Thank you. I have something put through to the chat to panelists. So it's for Esther, a question from Suganini. Thanks for an interesting presentation. Were you able to isolate the contribution of the behavioural effect of policies, such as the baby bonus, that ran concurrently with the time period in your research?
Thank you for the question. So I think that couples generally always first try to have a baby naturally, and then some of them might be in need of assisted reproductive technologies if they see they can't achieve a baby by themselves. So I think that's the main role of ART, of really helping couples that already have decided that they want a baby to eventually have it if they are not able because of a biological barrier. So I think that this type of policies are quite different. And the only policy effect that I've seen in my data was around 2011, when there was like a decline in births because of an introduction of a cut in the public funding for ART. And that's probably the thing that couples would be more sensitive about when deciding whether or not to use ART.
Thank you very much. So I think we have come to the end of the Q&A session. I'd like to thank you all very much again, the panelists, for your presentations today. It's really exciting to see the research that's going on across Australia. So very big thank you to you all. Now, the final webinar is on this afternoon in this Australian population webinar series. It's Dr. David Gruen, the Australian statistician, and he's going to be talking about how COVID-19 changed the data requirements for Australia. If you haven't registered, you still can through Eventbrite. And for those of you who are in Canberra, you can actually come and see him live with registrations also through Eventbrite. I'd like to thank the entire organising committee for putting together all of these sessions. So I was ably assisted by James O'Donnell, Brian Hull, Denise Carlton and Tanuja Doss, and also we received substantial assistance from Anna Ramondos. So thank you very much, everyone, and look forward to seeing you all again in person one day, but certainly online. Bye, everyone.